Emma Thompson sat on her balcony sipping her morning coffee, but the pleasant moment was shattered by the sound of jackhammers. Again, the construction site next door had been a constant source of irritation for weeks. How could they allow such a disturbance in her pristine, upscale neighborhood? She peered over the fence, narrowing her eyes at the man operating the machinery. He was covered in dust, wearing old jeans and a beat-up cap, the kind of man she assumed couldn't possibly afford to live in this area. How did he even get the permits? Grabbing her phone, she dialed the police, her voice tight with frustration. "Hello? Yes. I'd like to report a disturbance at 124 Oakwood. There's a construction worker who doesn't seem to have proper permits for what he's doing. It's incredibly disruptive." As she ended the call, Emma smirked. She wasn't going to let someone like him bring down the value of her home. Who did he think he was? Minutes later, the police cruiser pulled up. Officer Davis stepped out, nodding politely at Emma before walking over to the man. Emma folded her arms, satisfied, ready to watch the worker get shut down. But as Officer Davis spoke to the man, Emma noticed something strange. Instead of taking out his notebook, the officer seemed hesitant. He even shook the man's hand, nodding as they spoke in low tones. Emma frowned, leaning in closer to hear their conversation. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. "I didn't know it was your block." Your block? Emma's mind raced. What could that possibly mean? Was there something about this man she didn't know? Her heart pounded as the officer turned and walked back to his cruiser, leaving Emma standing on her balcony, confused and angry. What had just happened? Who was this man? Why did the officer seem so deferential? Emma had no idea, but she was determined to find out. Emma's irritation festered as she watched the police cruiser drive off. How had this man managed to avoid trouble? Her frustration bubbled over, and without thinking, she marched out of her house and stormed toward the construction site. The closer she got, the louder the clanging and drilling became, grating on her nerves. But what bothered her even more was the thought of being outsmarted by a construction worker of all people. "Excuse me." Emma's voice cut through the noise as she stepped onto the dirt-filled lot. The man, Liam, she learned from overhearing the officer, turned off his machine and turned to face her, wiping the sweat from his brow. His expression was calm, even kind, which only made Emma angrier. "Yes?" he asked, looking at her with the same pleasant expression that had greeted the officer. "What exactly are you doing here?" she snapped. "You've been causing chaos in this neighborhood for weeks. I've already called the police, and I'm prepared to call them again if you don't show me your permits." Liam tilted his head, seemingly unfazed. "I've got all the necessary permits, ma'am. I'm not doing anything illegal." His calm demeanor sent a wave of irritation through Emma. She crossed her arms tightly across her chest. "Well, I find that hard to believe. You're disturbing everyone around here, and frankly, I don't think you belong in this neighborhood. People like you—" She stopped, catching herself before finishing the sentence, but the implication was clear. Liam's eyebrows raised slightly, but he didn't react with anger or defensiveness. Instead, he smiled faintly. "People like me?" Emma flushed, but pressed on. "What exactly are you building here, and how can you even afford to live in this part of town?" Liam leaned against the side of the building, still annoyingly composed. "I'm just fixing up the place, making it the way I want it." "The way you want it?" Emma scoffed, her patience wearing thin. "You're acting like you own this place." Liam's smile widened, but he said nothing, letting the silence hang in the air. His lack of response unnerved her. "What's that supposed to mean?" she demanded. "It means," Liam said slowly, "you'll understand soon enough." Emma stood frozen, her heart pounding. What was this man hinting at? Why wasn't he more defensive? As Liam turned and resumed his work, Emma's confusion deepened. There was something he wasn't telling her. That night, Emma couldn't shake her encounter with Liam. His cryptic response haunted her, leaving a knot of unease in her stomach. Who did this man think he was? And what was the officer talking about? His block? The next day, the noise from the construction site was even louder than before. Fed up, Emma marched back over, her intention clear. This time, she would demand answers. As she approached, she noticed something strange. The structure wasn't what she expected. Instead of a small renovation, it looked like a high-end, luxurious home was taking shape. The materials were top tier, the kind you'd find in exclusive developments. Confusion clouded her mind as she approached Liam, who was overseeing the workers. Liam spotted her and waved, almost cheerfully. "Morning, ma'am." Emma didn't return the smile. "What exactly is going on here? This doesn't look like a normal renovation." Liam nodded, looking around at the progress with pride. "I'm building something special." Before Emma could respond, the sound of a car pulling up caught her attention. She turned to see Officer Davis stepping out of his cruiser again. A lump formed in Emma's throat as the officer approached. "Back again, huh?" Officer Davis said to Liam with a friendly nod. Emma felt a pang of jealousy at their familiarity. "We're making good progress," Liam replied, still calm. Officer Davis turned to Emma, his expression softening. "You should take a look inside, ma'am. I think you'll find it enlightening." Emma blinked in surprise. Why was the officer so involved? Before she could protest, Liam gestured toward the entrance. "Care to join us for a tour?" Caught off guard, Emma hesitated. This was not how she'd planned the confrontation to go, but curiosity got the better of her. Reluctantly, she nodded and followed Liam and the officer inside the half-built structure. The moment Emma stepped through the door, she was taken aback. The interior was stunning. Marble countertops, custom woodwork, and vaulted ceilings. It was the kind of design you'd see in multi-million-dollar homes. But more than that, it didn't feel like a construction site. It felt finished, like a dream home already coming to life. Emma's heart raced. Who was this man? As they moved from room to room, Emma couldn't stop the questions swirling in her mind. Liam was no ordinary construction worker, but if he wasn't just some hired help, who was he? That night, Emma sat at her computer, determined to uncover the truth. Her fingers flew over the keyboard as she searched for information on Liam Carter. Nothing came up at first. She scanned through construction companies, real estate records, and even social media, but it was like he didn't exist. Then, buried deep in an article about local real estate, Emma found it. Liam Carter, a multi-millionaire property developer known for quietly acquiring entire city blocks and renovating them into high-end residential spaces. Emma's breath caught in her throat. He wasn't just working on one house, he owned the entire block, including her home. Her heart pounded as she stared at the screen. How had she not known? How could someone so unassuming own everything around her? The implications of this hit hard. She had judged him based on his appearance, his job, his clothes, and now she felt foolish. She sank back into her chair, trying to process it all. Liam Carter, the man she had accused of disrupting her life, was the owner of the very neighborhood she prided herself on. And worse, he had never once mentioned it. Emma's mind raced. What would she say to him now? Could she even face him after how she had acted? Emma's stomach churned as she paced back and forth in her living room. How could she have been so blind? Every time she thought about her confrontation with Liam, a wave of embarrassment washed over her. She had judged him based on his appearance, his job, and what she assumed was his financial status, only to discover he was the owner of the entire block, including her home. She needed to apologize. But how? Emma walked to her window and looked out at the construction site next door. The workers were there, but Liam wasn't in sight. She felt a pang of nervousness. Apologies weren't something she was used to giving, especially not to someone she had looked down on. After a few deep breaths, Emma mustered the courage and headed over. She approached the site cautiously, half hoping Liam wouldn't be there, but as she turned the corner she saw him standing near a group of workers, giving instructions. He looked up and spotted her. "Emma, right?" he said with a friendly smile, as though the previous confrontations had never happened. The fact that he remembered her name made her flinch with guilt. "Yes," she muttered, feeling awkward. She swallowed hard and stepped forward. I need to talk to you." Liam nodded, sensing her discomfort. He gestured for her to follow him away from the noise. They walked to the far end of the lot where the sounds of construction were quieter. Emma's heart raced as she faced him. "I need to apologize," she blurted out, her words tumbling over each other. "I didn't know. I made assumptions about you. I shouldn't have acted the way I did. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." Liam studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, to her surprise, he chuckled softly. "You're not the first to assume things about me," he said gently. "People look at me, see the dust and the work clothes, and think they've got me figured out. But we all make assumptions, don't we?" Emma nodded, feeling the weight of his words. She realized now that her actions had been based on more than just annoyance at the construction noise. She had judged him because she thought he didn't belong in her world. But it turned out she didn't even know what that world truly was. "Why didn't you tell me you owned the block?" she asked, curious now. Liam smiled again, but this time there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. "What would have changed if I had? Would it have made you treat me differently?" Emma blinked, realizing the truth behind his words. He was right. Knowing his wealth wouldn't have made her less judgmental, it would have only shifted her bias. She would have treated him better because of his status, not because of who he truly was. "You're right," she admitted. "I wouldn't have. And that's something I need to work on." Liam nodded, his expression softening. "It's all right. We all learn in different ways. But the truth is, I'm not doing this for recognition. This block has history. My wife's history. We're not just building a home, we're restoring something that's been lost." Emma's curiosity piqued. "Your wife? She's connected to this place?" Liam nodded, and for the first time, Emma saw a deep emotion flicker in his eyes. "She grew up here. Before the area was gentrified, this was her childhood neighborhood, and we're trying to bring back a piece of it." Later that evening, as Emma sat on her couch, she couldn't stop thinking about what Liam had said. His words lingered in her mind, and a curiosity burned inside her. She hadn't expected his reasoning for buying the block to be so personal, so meaningful. The next morning, there was a knock on Emma's door. She opened it to find a woman standing there, her expression warm and inviting. She looked familiar, but Emma couldn't quite place her. "Hello," the woman said, smiling. "I'm Sarah, Liam's wife." Emma blinked in surprise. "Oh, hi. I wasn't expecting. It's nice to meet you." Sarah chuckled softly. "I thought it might be a good idea to introduce myself. Liam told me you two had spoken, and I wanted to explain why we're doing this." Emma stepped aside, gesturing for Sarah to come in. They sat down in the living room, and Sarah's presence felt strangely comforting. There was something about her that put Emma at ease. "This neighborhood," Sarah began, "was once a vibrant community. I grew up here, but over time it changed. People like my family were pushed out as property values soared, and new developments took over." Emma listened intently, feeling a twinge of guilt as she thought about how she had been one of those who benefited from the gentrification of the area. "My parents lost their home when I was a teenager," Sarah continued, her voice soft. "It was devastating. But Liam and I always dreamed of coming back, not just to build a house, but to bring back the spirit of what this place used to be." Emma's throat tightened as she realized the depth of their connection to the neighborhood. This wasn't just about a construction project, it was about reclaiming something that had been stolen from them. "I didn't know," Emma said quietly. "I didn't realize any of this." Sarah smiled kindly. "Most people don't, but we're not doing this to prove a point. We just want to create a space where our family can feel connected to its roots." Emma nodded, feeling an overwhelming sense of humility. "Thank you for telling me this. I'm sorry for how I acted. I was so focused on my own annoyance that I didn't stop to think about what this place might mean to someone else." Sarah reached out and touched Emma's hand gently. "It's okay. We all have moments where we don't see the bigger picture, but I appreciate your willingness to listen." Before Sarah left, she handed Emma a small envelope. "We're having a housewarming party in a few weeks. I'd love for you to come. It might help you understand what we're trying to build here." Emma took the envelope, feeling a lump in her throat. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. As Sarah left, Emma sat down and opened the envelope. Inside was a beautifully designed invitation, and for the first time in weeks, she smiled. Maybe this was her chance to make things right. The party invitation felt like an olive branch, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more to learn. What was the real reason behind Liam and Sarah's return? Was it just nostalgia, or was there something deeper they hadn't revealed? On the day of the party, Emma stood outside the newly completed house, her heart pounding with a mix of nervousness and anticipation. She had no idea what to expect, but she knew this was an opportunity for her to make amends. As she walked through the doors, she was greeted by the sight of a stunning, warm, and inviting home. It was clear that every detail had been carefully chosen to reflect not only luxury, but also love and history. Liam and Sarah were surrounded by friends and family, all laughing and enjoying the space. Emma approached cautiously, unsure of how she would be received. But when Liam spotted her, he smiled and waved her over. "Emma, I'm glad you made it." Emma exhaled, relieved by his welcoming tone. "Thank you for inviting me," she said, her voice steady but nervous. Liam and Sarah exchanged a glance, and then Sarah spoke. "We're glad you're here. We wanted to show you what this place means to us and why it's so important." As Emma spent the evening mingling with the guests, she realized that this wasn't just a house. It was a symbol of community, of second chances, and of the importance of looking beyond the surface. By the end of the night, Emma felt a weight lift off her shoulders. She had learned a valuable lesson. Wealth wasn't about possessions or appearances. It was about connection, family, and history, and she had been given a chance to be part of that. A week after the housewarming party, Emma sat in her kitchen, sipping tea as the morning sun filtered through the windows. The neighborhood felt different now, quieter somehow, but in a way that was calming rather than unsettling. She couldn't stop thinking about Liam, Sarah, and the history they were restoring. Her thoughts wandered back to her own life. For years, Emma had prided herself on her success, on the pristine appearance of her home and her place in the neighborhood. But now, she realized how narrow her world had been. She hadn't even known the people around her. The block had become little more than a collection of properties to her, not a community of individuals with stories, struggles, and dreams. With a sigh, she got up and walked to her bookshelf, pulling down an old photo album. She flipped through the pages, her fingers tracing the images of her family. There were pictures of her parents when they had first moved to the city, before the neighborhood had become what it was today. They'd been hopeful, optimistic, like Sarah and Liam. Emma couldn't help but feel a pang of regret. She had let herself drift away from the values her parents had once held dear, the values of hard work and neighborly connections. She wondered how her mother and father would have felt about the changes in the neighborhood, about the way she had distanced herself from the community. Emma stared at a picture of herself as a child, standing in front of her childhood home, and a sudden realization hit her. There was something she could do to honor her parents' legacy and the community they had loved. The next day, Emma took a deep breath and stepped out of her house, a sense of determination filling her. She hadn't spoken to many of her neighbors in years, but that was going to change. Her first stop was Mrs. Patterson's house, the elderly woman who lived 2 doors down. Emma knocked on the door, unsure of what to expect. When Mrs. Patterson opened it, her face lit up in surprise. "Emma, I haven't seen you in ages, dear." Emma smiled warmly. "I know, Mrs. Patterson. I've been a bit distant lately, but I wanted to come by and see how you're doing." Mrs. Patterson invited Emma in, and they spent the next hour chatting about the old days, how the neighborhood had changed, and how much it still meant to both of them. Emma listened, really listened, to the stories Mrs. Patterson had to share. By the time she left, Emma felt a sense of connection she hadn't felt in years. She continued her visits to other neighbors over the next few days, learning more about the people she had once ignored. Each conversation brought a new perspective, and slowly, Emma began to see the neighborhood as more than just a place where she lived. It was a community. One day, as Emma was leaving another neighbor's house, she noticed a small flyer stuck to her mailbox. It was an invitation to a meeting about the future of the block. Intrigued, she opened it and saw that the meeting was being organized by Liam and Sarah. The day of the meeting arrived, and Emma walked into the local community center with a mix of curiosity and excitement. The room was filled with neighbors, people she hadn't spoken to in years. Some she'd never even met. At the front of the room, Liam and Sarah stood, greeting everyone as they arrived. Emma took a seat near the back, unsure of what the meeting would entail. As the crowd settled in, Liam stepped forward and cleared his throat. "Thank you all for coming today," he began. "Sarah and I wanted to bring everyone together because we believe that this block, this community, has so much potential. We're not just building a home, we're trying to restore something that was lost." He paused, glancing around the room. "We want to hear from all of you. What do you think this block needs? How can we bring back the sense of community that used to be here?" The room was quiet for a moment, but then, slowly, hands began to go up. One by one, neighbors shared their thoughts and ideas. Some wanted more green spaces, others talked about organizing neighborhood events, and a few brought up the need for affordable housing so the area wouldn't push out long-time residents. As Emma listened, she felt a swell of hope. For the first time in years, it felt like people were coming together, like they were working toward a common goal. When it was her turn to speak, Emma stood, her voice steady.